Hello, my name's Lynn. I'm the voice behind the videos that you'll be watching for your Functional Skills English Level 2 exams. So in all the different videos I'll be taking you through some of the different strategies for the reading, the writing and the speaking and listening exam. We'll look at some of the wording of the questions, some of the things you need to do to get the maximum marks, and we'll go through some practice exam questions together. For all of the videos you may find it useful to have a piece of paper to make notes, or you can take screenshots or photographs or rewind and fast forward the videos at any point so that you can recap on something or you can find the part that's most relevant to you. So there's lots of different videos in the series. Make sure that you have a look at all the ones you think will be relevant to the exam you're doing and the things you need to practice. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next video and good luck with your functional skills exams. In this video, I'd like to take you through some information on sentence structure and paragraphing. So you may want to take a few notes or take some screenshots. And we're going to have a look at paragraphs first, and then we're going to have a look at sentences. So we're going to have a quick look at some key vocabulary. We're going to discuss what makes a good paragraph. We're actually going to see the process for putting together your plan and your paragraphs for your exam text. Then we're going to talk about the different types of sentences. We'll examine each type and see some examples. And then there's a little task for you to do at the end where you're going to assess whether sentences are written correctly and punctuated correctly or not. I'd suggest it's useful to have already watched the punctuation videos if you wish to, because some of the information we'll talk about with commas and semicolons here is assumed knowledge already, so I'm assuming that you know already how to use commas and semicolons within your sentences. So first of all, a couple of bits of key vocabulary that we need to know. You don't need to know these for the exam as such, but they're useful to know as we go through the presentation, just to help you understand how sentences have been put together. So don't worry if you can't actually remember these terms after we've finished. So the first term is independent clause. So a clause is an idea or a complete thought. So a clause is an idea or complete thought. An independent clause is a phrase that has both a subject and a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. So a sentence on its own that makes sense with a subject, a verb and a complete thought can be thought of as an independent clause. A subordinate clause is also known as a dependent clause, and that's because it has a subject and a verb, as the last one did, but this time it does not express a complete thought of its own. So just kind of think of those terms as we go through. You may find them useful a little later. First, we're going to have a look at paragraphing. Now, paragraphs, one thing people always tell me is hard to know is when do they actually start a new paragraph? So some people say 4 or 5 sentences. There's lots of different rules out there, and unfortunately there isn't actually a proper rule to follow as such, and that's why people find it quite difficult. So I'm just going to take you through a few ideas around paragraphs. So there is one sort of main rule that you can use, and that's to start a new paragraph when the topic changes or there's a change in the person or the time period. Now that rule sounds great on paper, but it can actually be quite difficult to do when you're writing. People are saying, is this the same topic? Is it different? Everything's about the same main topic, so it can be quite difficult to know when to change. So hopefully it'll become a little clearer as we go through. Really important to do some planning. I'll mention this again later, but planning is really key to doing well in writing in general, not just on the test, but in general writing. If you're perhaps going onto a course where you need to do some writing for university or a workplace learning course, it's still good to plan. I know probably after you left school you thought you wouldn't have to plan anything again, but actually planning is a really good skill. And what I suggest for paragraphs is actually sometimes more useful to plan the contents around the paragraphs. So if you start off by having 4 to 6 things that you want to say about the main topic, those 4 to 6 things can then help to form the separate paragraphs. So you may have 6 paragraphs, you may have 4, you may decide to combine some things together. But originally, those 4 to 6 things are kind of your 4 or 6 separate ideas that you're going to break your overall piece down into. Now, if you're thinking you've only got one message, if it's actually going to be quite a long message, then it's probably got a few key ideas within it that you can break down into sentences as you go, and then paragraphs. Some people find that they write it all as one block first and then split it up. That is a possibility, but actually if we look at how we're going to put together our paragraphs as we go through this presentation, we actually don't need to do that. By structuring each topic around a theme and around the correct paragraph structure, we can actually write a much better piece. So this is how a paragraph should ideally be structured. The first thing you have is what we call your topic sentence, a sort of an introduction sentence. The other thing you can call it is your point. So what point are you actually making in this paragraph? So the topic sentence should tell the reader what's coming up in that paragraph. It's like a preview of the paragraph. The second thing you should have are the details. So what stuff do you actually want to include? So you should have some different sentence structures within this, maybe some facts, opinions, quotes, just information, description, all of that stuff, that's the details. And then third, a summative sentence that should sum up the point that you've made in the paragraph. Now this doesn't have to be as obvious as people think, and we'll see a couple of examples later that actually when you read them, you realise they're doing the job, but without actually being obvious about it. And if you can get into this habit of structuring your paragraphs like this, it's actually a good habit to get into because it works well on reports, as I say, essays, even emails, and it gives you a much better chance of getting your message across and people actually understanding what you're trying to say. So here's an example of a paragraph that's actually set out using that structure. The event will be held at Brunsgrove Hall in Deartree. The location has been chosen as it has free parking for 200 cars and is close to the junction of the motorway as well as being 10 minutes from the station. This means the hall should be accessible to everyone. So our topic sentence is this first one here. The event will be held, so we know we're talking about an event and its location. The detail is all more information about that location. We've got some facts, 200 cars, motorway junction, free parking. And then we have our summative sentence about the hall being accessible to everyone. So the main detail has all been about what's there, and that is the accessibility of it. So location, the parking, the motorway, it's all about accessibility. So hopefully you can see that how the structure's worked, but again, it's not obvious. It doesn't stand out as being an odd paragraph or oddly structured. And that's what you're aiming for as well, a nicely flowing paragraph that has all of the key details in. I'm going to show you a worked example now of how to sort of put together a piece of writing on a topic, and we'll see one particular paragraph. So this piece of work is all about chocolate. Now it goes into a bit more detail than you'd be expected to do in the exam, but it is just a nice example of what you can do. So as I've mentioned before, always start by making a plan. So this is quite a fancy plan. Also, you could do a bullet pointed list, you could just scribble it down on a piece of paper, you could type it out. A spider diagram, really doesn't matter how you choose to plan. You can just plan in your head. Although I often think if you write it down, you're more likely to have a good piece of work. So my topic is chocolate, and I'm planning the different mini topics or things to do with chocolate I could talk about. So we've got popular brands, nutritional information, types, the media, history, how it's made. Those are my 6 things. I mentioned 4 to 6 earlier. Next, I want to decide on the order I'm going to talk about these in, and this might change afterwards. So I've decided to start off with the history, then the types, then how it's made, nutritional information, popularity, and then chocolate in the media. I may decide as I'm writing to skip some of those or to combine them, and that's fine. And again, I can rearrange it afterwards if I wish to. So I'm going to focus on number 1, the history of chocolate. And I've done some research and made some notes. So these are the facts I found. So these could be things that you know, things you want to say. Now in the exam, you won't have time really to do this kind of note taking. You'll just start to write it and then refine it as you go along. You might have time to make a few notes, but this is more detailed than you would really have time for. If you're typing it out, of course, you can write these points and then incorporate them within your paragraph, so you're not actually wasting time. So we've got things like the time period, the meaning of the word, the Aztecs, this drink, the name, the actual use of the word in English. And I may not want to use all of this information. This is just my research. I've then done a review of what information I have, and I've actually decided I'll probably split it into Mayans and Aztecs because there's a lot of information there. I'm actually going to have an extra paragraph. It may be that I decide not to include any of the Aztec stuff after all because of time pressure, and again, that's decisions you can make. So first of all, I need to think of a topic sentence to introduce it. Now I wanted to write about history, so I decided to say the history of chocolate is a long and varied one. So you can tell that my paragraph is going to be about history, and I'm going to be talking about how long and changeable the history has been. Sometimes people go back and write the topic sentence afterwards, or they go and refine it once they've written the paragraph. Always good to go back and check that actually the topic sentence does cover what you've talked about. This is what I want to say in the detail or the main body. So I'm going to be talking about when chocolate was first recorded, the Mayans collecting beans, what the word comes from, that they brewed a spicy drink and added chili, and the European settlers, and how they changed the name. If you'd like to pause and read it in a bit more detail, please do feel free. So that's all of the detail that I want to put in, just in that one paragraph. I then need to decide what I want to say in my concluding or summary sentence. So I decided to say, therefore, the Mayans were the first humans to experience what we know today as chocolate. So really I wanted to sum up the idea of the history and how changeable it was and the variety. Now I can put all of that together, so you can see at the start I've got my topic sentence, I've got my main body, and I've got my concluding sentence. So my paragraph is almost ready. I'm going to do the first proofreading, so I'm going to have a quick read through to check for any obvious mistakes, check it all makes sense. When I've done the final piece, I can do a second proofreading. So let's have a look. Did you spot any mistakes earlier? There were 2 actual mistakes there. So I had, I think I'd missed out one of these words in the rainforest, it should have said, and added, let's just go back, see if you can spot this. I put 1500 years ago rainforest instead of in the rainforest, and added actually had 3 Ds. So if you're one of the people that spotted that, then well done. So always do your first proofread and look for your mistakes. I've also, in that point, when I'm doing my proofreading, I'm thinking of anything in the order that I might want to change around. And what I've decided to do is to move this part about the changing the name here after the meaning of the word, because it makes sense, I think, to talk about the word itself and then to talk about using the beans to make a drink. So I've changed the order around a little there, not made any other changes at the moment. Again, I can do at the end if I wish to. And that's my paragraph finished. So I'm going to get you to try out that technique a little bit now. There's a paragraph on the next slide. Some of the sentences aren't in the right order. Can you in there spot the topic sentence and the summary or concluding sentence? They're not where they should be. There's also a sentence in there that shouldn't really be in that paragraph. It doesn't fit. Can you spot it? So I'll put the paragraph on, pause the video so you can read it through in your own time, and then we'll carry on in a second and I'll tell you what I think it should look like. Okay, so on the next slide I'm going to show you what I think the structure should be. So this sentence here in green, this should have been the introduction sentence, the topic sentence. So the pineapple is a spiky skinned tropical compound fruit with aromatic, sweet, sour, juicy yellow flesh and a fibrous core. That kind of defines that we're going to be talking about the pineapple in terms of sort of its flavour. Then we've got all of our detail. This red sentence about mango juice, that's the one that doesn't fit. We've not linked it to pineapple juice in any way, and it just isn't in the right place there. That would be a good way to start another paragraph perhaps, but not in this one. Then our concluding sentence, pineapple can be the basis of a number of interesting recipes. So it sums up that we've been talking here all about how you can eat pineapple. So hopefully that's just giving you a bit of a flavour of how you can put paragraphs together. Just focusing a little bit more on the exam, a good length for each piece of writing, there'll be 2 on there, is about 300 words. Now you don't have to count them. You can if you wish. I don't think the Edexcel one currently does a word count on there. But you might want to just have a little look at a couple of pieces of writing, maybe type a few words on that practice test, just to give you an idea of exactly how many words sort of you can fit in at the time. I would always aim for a minimum of 3 paragraphs on the exam. Now the paragraph that you've just read about pineapples was about 100 words. So if you're going to do quite chunky paragraphs like that one, if we look, it's quite a long paragraph, then you only need 3 of those. If yours are going to be a bit shorter, then you'll need a few more. I think a good number is 4 body paragraphs, so 4 like we've just seen, plus a short intro and conclusion. Again, you might do more, you might do less. I always suggest, as I did before, that you have 6 points you could talk about. Pick your best 4, write about those. If you feel that they haven't quite worked, you could swap one for another, or if you feel that it's too short, you can add in an extra point. So it's always good to have those sort of backup points to talk about. And then once you've got those, you've put together your full exam piece. Make sure you leave a line between your paragraphs as well. Don't need to indent them anymore, just leave a blank line between. And then you're done. Paragraphs are set for the exam and you should get the full structural marks from the examiner. I'd like to talk more about sentences now, sentence structure. There are 3 different types of sentences: simple, compound and complex. You can then actually combine those so you can have a complex compound and so on, but we won't worry too much about that today. Some things to tell you. A lot of people think the longer the sentence, the better. That isn't necessarily the case. Sometimes a long sentence just means that you've crammed too many ideas into one thing, and actually it doesn't work at all. I suggest you should try and use a variety of sentence types in your writing. The examiners are looking for that variety to give you the full marks. If you have too many simple sentences, your writing just won't flow. It'll have a stop-start feel to it. Too many complex sentences can make it difficult for the reader to understand and follow. I always say if you have to go back and read a sentence twice, then it probably wasn't a well put together sentence. So let's take a look at simple sentences first. We need to remember some of our vocabulary from earlier. So simple sentences are all just one complete thought, one idea or independent clause on their own. They must have a subject. Now a subject is a person, place or thing. This was covered in the grammar video, so if you've seen that one, you'll be familiar with the idea of having a subject, a person, place or thing, and a verb, an action. Now a simple sentence can be short, it can also be long. It doesn't necessarily because it's simple that it's short. As long as it fits those rules above, then it's still fine. If you use a simple sentence, you're conveying an important point and then you're helping it to stand out by not confusing the audience with any other information. Let's look at some examples of simple sentences. You must return the completed document by Friday 13th of June. So the subject is you and the verb is must return. The manager is Jill Roberts. I'm writing to complain about the service. Birmingham is a great place for families to find things to do. Residents have been complaining about the proposal for a new supermarket. So those are all simple sentences of varying lengths. So don't forget you can use a semicolon to join two simple sentences together. So this was information that you'll have learned if you watched the punctuation video or videos that I did. So if you're not familiar with semicolons, you may want to go away and have a look at those videos. So here's an example of joining two simple sentences together with a semicolon. Birmingham is a great place for families to find things to do. It has all the facilities that families might want. What you should definitely not do is join simple sentences together with a comma. So if you can see where the semicolon is here, if that was a comma instead, then it would be wrong. It would be what we call a comma splice. And again, we talked about that when we did the punctuation videos. So we've looked at simple sentences. We're going to have a look at compound sentences now. So what they do is join two complete ideas, two independent clauses, using one of the following conjunctions: for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. Now those of you that have got kids at school, you may have heard them talking about fanboys, and that's the acronym for remembering those conjunctions. So fanboys. And that's probably why they keep the words nor and yet in, because nor, very few people obviously use that word now. Yet sometimes used, but not very commonly, but it does just help to make the acronym. So here are some examples of compound sentences. I am writing to complain about the service and I'm upset about the length of time I had to wait. So this part here is an independent clause. You could read that on its own and it would make sense. This part here could also be read on its own and would make sense. So that means it's fine to join them with one of our fanboys. Birmingham is a great place for families to find things to do, but I wouldn't recommend it for older people. Again, the first and second parts are independent clauses, so could be read separately and can be joined with a conjunction. Residents have been complaining about the proposal for a new supermarket, so somebody from the council needs to respond to them. Again, both parts could be read separately, and so we can join them with the conjunction so. Now generally you'll have seen we use a comma before these words. Now there can be some exceptions when using and mainly the exceptions are when you're not actually joining two independent clauses. It's more about when you're using and as part of a list. So that's something you could look into a bit more if you want to find out a bit more about that. So let's just check our use of commas here. It's important that you read the terms and conditions fully, and you must return a signed copy of them to us. So we're using the comma before and. The letter we sent on the 3rd of March instructed you to contact us within 5 working days, comma, but we have not received a response. So we've used our commas here, and as you can see on the previous examples, commas before all of those conjunctions. So that was compound sentences. Now we move on to complex sentences. Now these have one complete thought, which we call an independent. We can also call it a main clause, and one additional part, and that's called a subordinate or dependent clause. Remember, we looked at that meaning earlier on. So there are various ways you can structure your complex sentences, and that might depend upon the emotion or tone you want to convey, or where you want to put the emphasis within the sentence. So the subordinate clause, the bit that depends on the other part, can go at the start of the sentence, in the middle, or at the end. So we'll see an example of each of those. Here's the subordinate clause at the start. If you're in the Midlands, Birmingham is a great place for families to find things to do. In the middle, residents, including owners of holiday homes, have been complaining about the proposal for a new supermarket. And at the end, I'm writing to complain about the service, which was unacceptable. Let's go back and just review. If we're using the subordinate clause at the start, there's a number of what we call subordinating conjunctions that you can actually start your sentence with. So in this example, we started with the word if. And you'll see that's in the list here. There's a whole host of other words in there. Great words to use on the exam: after and although, until, if of course is a good one. If you want to use any of the others, of course you can, but those are probably the slightly easier ones to be able to use. And you might want to take a screenshot of that if you'd like to remember them. So those are using the subordinate clause at the start. If you start your sentence with the subordinate clause, then the comma will go after that clause. And you'll notice there should be a natural pause in the sentence at the point where the comma goes. So if you're not sure where to put the comma, read the sentence out loud and you should be able to spot that natural pause. Now, one reason to put the subordinate clause at the beginning is it can make it more dramatic. It can also indicate the part of the sentence you feel is most important, or reinforce a time frame, and we'll see some examples of those. Now in this example, putting the subordinate clause at the beginning adds a bit more drama to the sentence. When the earthquake struck, there was chaos throughout the city. Now we could of course have turned it round. There was chaos throughout the city when the earthquake struck, but I feel it doesn't have as much drama. We can use it to show a time frame. After the lesson was over, there was a disturbance outside of classroom 3. So the subordinate clause there has helped us emphasise the time frame. And to show the important bit of the sentence, so the bit you want to focus on. Although the new report format is easy to use, many people feel the new reports lack the correct level of detail. So that structure there just helps us to highlight the things I think are important when I'm making my point. If you want to use the subordinate clause at the end of your sentence, then you don't need to put a comma in front of it. And you'll notice when you're reading these back that there isn't that natural pause that we had before. The reason to use the subordinate clause at the end, it does follow the natural speech rhythm and flow a little bit more than the other forms. However, if you have too many sentences that are all this format, the writing can seem a bit flat. We're lacking that sort of drama that we saw before. So here are some examples. The students were ready to work until they saw that it was snowing. So we can see the word until is one of our words from the list. So by using it, we're creating a complex sentence, but we don't need to use the comma because it's not at the beginning. It was time for Jonathan to finish his work and go home, even though he hadn't completed all of his tasks. And the even though is that making the sentence complex there. We have got an and, but this and isn't used for putting two compound sentences together. It's almost like part of a list: finish the work, go home. The council have not provided us with any information about the new construction site, whereas our neighbour receives an information pack. Again, the whereas there is you're following the correct compound sentence structure. No comma needed because there's no natural pause in those sentences. Here's just a few more examples to show you how you can change the order around. Until I receive the information, I cannot continue with the project. So for me, that's putting the emphasis there on making sure I receive the information. The next one, I cannot continue with the project until I receive the information. To me, it's putting the emphasis on me not being able to carry on. So both are equally fine. It would depend, I think, which one you wanted to put the emphasis on. If you've completed the forms by Friday, the information can be processed on Monday. The information can be processed on Monday if you have completed the forms by Friday. Now again, I think that the first one puts the emphasis on the person completing the forms, whereas the second one puts the emphasis on the processing of the forms. Now we mentioned that the subordinate clause can also go in the middle. It does that by interrupting the main clause, and to show this, we put a pair of commas around that subordinate clause. So it's not at the beginning or the end of the sentence, it's in the middle and it's surrounded by a pair of commas. That means that we could actually lift that part out and the sentence would still read correctly from beginning to end. So we'll read it as it is. The documents, which will be sent on Tuesday, outline the terms and conditions. We can lift this part out, read the sentence, and it should still make sense. The documents outline the terms and conditions. This one here, Celia Jones, the head of marketing, will be leading tomorrow's meeting. This part here, the subordinate clause, adds a bit more information, adds more detail to what's gone before. And I would encourage you in your writing to try to create these kind of sentences. So if you've put your subject, like a person's name or a place, try and think of some extra detail that you could add in a pair of commas here to create. So you'll be getting marks for using commas and sentence structure marks. The pair of commas also help the reader because the reader can see the information inside the pair of commas is of less importance. The spring term, while being my favourite, was the longest within the year. So we can see that this bit about it being the favourite, that's not the information I want to emphasise. It's not the most important thing. It's just extra. Just quickly want to mention relative pronouns. Not important that you remember the name is relative pronouns. If you think back to the grammar video, if you've seen that one, I mentioned pronouns, and pronouns are words that can replace a noun. So a noun is a person, place, or thing. So table, a pronoun could be it. Barry, a pronoun would be he. So they replace the noun within the sentence. These relative pronouns are a little bit different, and these are the relative pronouns we can use. So that, whichever, whom, which, who, whoever. Now let's see them working. So if you use a relative pronoun to start a subordinate clause, there are two ways you can do so. One is, as we saw before, as additional information in the middle of your sentence, interrupting that main sentence. And remember, that would use a pair of commas. We can also use it at the end of a sentence to give additional information, and this time we do use a comma. So when we were doing our words before, words like until, if, as, we don't use a comma with those words. But with relative pronouns like whichever and who or that, then we do use a comma. We'll see an exception in a moment. So if we want to use it in the middle of a sentence, the spring term, which ran from 5th of January to 31st March, was the longest within the year. So we're using the word which here, but we can still lift this part out if we want and be left with a complete sentence. At the end, the employees all share the canteen, which had been recently painted. So I'm giving extra detail about the canteen, and the which refers to the canteen. So the which and that refer to things, who refers to people. So just to note, if the information given by the clause is essential to the understanding of the sentence, then you don't use a comma. Judy gave her work to the supervisor who was in charge of the night shift. So it's really important that we're not separating the idea of the supervisor and the idea that he's in charge or she's in charge of the night shift. So the information is crucial to the understanding. The RAC came to rescue the driver who had broken down on the A38. Again, it's all essential to the meaning of the sentence, so therefore we're not using the comma. So it's your turn now. I'm going to ask you to look at the following sentences and decide whether they are correctly or incorrectly written. So this could be the use of punctuation, the way they're structured, or the use of conjunctions. So for each sentence, you decide if it's correct or incorrect, and then I'll give you a little bit more information. I'll read each sentence out, and then if you want to pause and think about it a little bit longer, then please do. Or if you want to think about how you might correct it if you think it's wrong, then you will need time to pause. So the first sentence is, although I'm writing to complain, I had a terrible meal. So hopefully you've spotted that that sentence, it just doesn't work correctly. It starts off okay with although, so we could start a subordinate clause with although, but it doesn't make sense. If you start with although I am writing to complain, although is like a posh but, so it means that the bit after that should contrast what you've already said. So if you wanted to start like that, although I'm writing to complain, you then need to say something positive. Although I'm writing to complain, I still had an enjoyable evening. Something like that would work. At the moment, the use of although doesn't work, and we're also missing the comma. So if you start with although, you need to have a comma. So there should really be a comma somewhere here. But actually, we need to take out the although, and really we need to restructure this sentence. Let's have a look at another sentence. So don't forget, you can pause if you want to have a little bit more thinking time about these. Okay, so when I went for my interview, I had to remember to take my certificates. So this sentence is absolutely fine as it is. It starts with when. It's a complex sentence. It uses the comma correctly to match the when at the pause point, and everything is in the right order. Let's take a look at another. I think the council should provide free childcare for those who can't afford it. However, it would be difficult to organise. What do you think about that one? So I think here it's a bit of a mixed picture. There's a couple of things to comment on. One is, I think the council should provide free childcare for those who can't afford it. That bit is fine, no problems there. However, it would be difficult to organise. And again, structurally, there's absolutely no problem. However, contrast with the bit before. We've used the comma after however, which is correct. And everything does work. Some people have commented that it actually doesn't sound great. They think they could write a better version. And I think that's true. I'm sure there's a couple of better versions we could do on this one. But I think overall, if we're looking at the use of punctuation and structure and everything, there isn't actually anything wrong with it. Let's take a look at another. However, I think that sending emails is the best way to communicate. Have a think about this sentence. So, what I would say is it can go either way on this one. So, structurally, using however at the start with the comma is absolutely fine. It will all depend on what came before this sentence. This sentence can't stand on its own as a paragraph, or it cannot start a paragraph. There has to be something before it to contrast with, because however, again, is a posh but. So we need to contrast with something that's happened before. So it might be something like, many people think that emails depersonalize communication. However, I think that sending emails is the best way to communicate. So we do need that kind of contrast if we're going to have it in there. So depends what you decided on that one. Let's take a look at another. If you want to get a well-paid job, you need to have experience and qualifications. Have a little think about this one. Okay, I would say it's absolutely fine. Starting with if, it's a subordinate clause. It's got the comma here at the pause point, and everything structurally makes sense. So absolutely fine, this sentence. Next one. I enjoy studying books about history when I have time. Have a think what your decision is here. So unfortunately, this one is not correct. It uses when to start the subordinate clause, but because it's at the end of the sentence, we should not have this comma here. If we took the comma out, then the sentence would be fine. Our next sentence. I'm concerned that the fault with the pavement could cause someone, in particular an elderly person, to injure themselves. Okay, and this one is absolutely fine. We've got the part in the pair of commas with subordinate clause there. We could take that away and the sentence would read fine without it. Our next sentence. Students come to college to get qualifications, but they don't always want to put in a lot of effort. And this sentence needs a comma, and the comma needed is before this but. So it's one of those things, it's not a big issue, but it is something we did talk about. If you're joining your sentences with the conjunction but, you should have the comma before the but. Next one, the man was wearing a suit, he was carrying an umbrella. And hopefully you spotted that this is not a good sentence. This is what we call a comma splice, because both bits are independent clauses, could be read separately, and they've been joined with a comma. You could fix it by using a semicolon, or you could use a word like and. But you can't just join it with a comma there, that is wrong. Okay, let's take a look at the next one. London is a nice place to visit. Furthermore, it is a great place to live. quite tricky, this one, so have a good think. This one isn't quite there, it's very close. This comma should actually be a semicolon, because furthermore is an introductory word, which means we can take it out and we should check what's there, what's left, which is London is a nice place to visit, it is a great place to live. And then this comma actually then becomes a comma splice, joining these two together. As we said before, we can't use commas to join sentences. So this first comma here should be a semicolon. And then this comma matches the introductory word furthermore. So really well done if you managed to spot that. That is a really tricky one. Our next one. At work I use the computer all the time. I also make a lot of phone calls. So maybe we're getting to the swing of it now. Also a comma splice, because you've got a new sentence here, completely standalone, joined with a comma, doesn't work. You can use a semicolon, you could use and, can't just use a comma. Okay, our next one. You should organise your work, it will be much easier to read. And this sentence is absolutely fine. It's two separate clauses, independent clauses, joined together with a semicolon. Next one. Although the service was slow, I really enjoyed the meal. This one is absolutely fine. The although matches the comma, and this one makes sense because this enjoying creates the contrast with the slow service that fits the use of although. You can see from my letter that I am very disappointed and I will not be using your company again. This one is almost there, but what we're actually missing is the comma here, because I will not be using your company again is a separate independent clause. So it's a simple sentence of its own. We've joined it to another one with and. We should be using the comma here. Now again, not a big thing, but it is true. It should be there. So that brings us to the end of our sentences and paragraphs. I hope that was useful. Just a few things to remember. Do make sure you have variety in your types of sentences. So you're using some simple, some compound, some complex. On the level 2 exam, if you only use simple sentences, you won't be able to get the full range of marks available. As you're doing so, be careful with your use of commas and semicolons. Make sure you're putting them in the right places. Actually think about the craft of putting sentences together. Don't just write and hope for the best. Consider how you're crafting your sentences to make the best use of punctuation and emphasis as well. Don't be afraid to go back and make changes. Some people like to get all the information down and then go back afterwards and make it sound as good as it can and look as good as it can. Once you've got your sentence level right, think about your paragraph level as well. Make sure that's all correct. So how you're putting your paragraphs together with the main point first and then that supporting detail. And of course, planning makes perfect. So if you don't plan, and although it's quite interesting, for entry 3 exams, there's marks available for seeing the plan. After entry 3, there's no separate marks available for planning, but what they tend to say in the mark scheme is evidence, or you can see evidence of planning. And although that sounds odd, when I read a piece of work, I can tell when someone's planned it out, not necessarily done a full scale plan, but actually thought about it, because it flows much better. The order's there, the structure's there, it makes sense. Whereas when people don't plan, it can be quite disorganized and just harder to read. So do just take a few minutes. I know with the time pressures, people get worried that they're not going to be able to fit everything in the time. But actually, just taking 2 or 3 minutes out at the beginning and make a bullet pointed list of your 5 or 6 ideas, maybe some extra detail that you want to include with each of them. It gets those ideas out of your head onto the paper, and you can really see whether they actually make sense and fit the brief of the question. And then you can start putting it all together. If you just jump in writing first, it's less likely that you'll do as well on the test as the people that have planned it out. So good luck with your writing exams and putting your sentences and paragraphs together. And you can still use some of this information, again, if you go on to do further learning courses in the future as well. This sort of structure will work for any kind of writing, whether it's academic essays or just articles for workplace magazines.